Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the 2024 McCain Conference, Liberal Democracy, Challenges, and Critics. I'm Jeff McCrease. I'm the Deputy Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. And our next panel surrounds economic issues, and we're honored to have two very distinguished panelists today. Dr. Ann Case is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs Emeritus at Princeton University. She has been awarded the Kenneth J. Arrow Prize in Health Economics from the International Health Economics Association for her work on the links between economic status and health status in childhood, and the Cozzarelli Prize from the National Academy of Sciences for her research on midlife morbidity and mortality. Dr. Case is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. Your program notes our second speaker is Ms. Maya MacGuineas. However, due to an illness, Ms. MacGuineas cannot attend. Instead, we're honored to welcome to Annapolis Mr. Mark Goldwein, the Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, where he conducts research topics related to fiscal policy and the federal budget. He's frequently quoted in a number of major media outlets, and he works regularly with members of Congress. And additionally, he teaches economics at Johns Hopkins University and the University of California's DC campus. Mr. Goldwein is a recipient of the Johns Hopkins University Excellence in Teaching Award and was featured in the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy. At the conclusion of their opening comments, we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience, and we'd ask you to please come down to one of the microphones here in the aisle to pose your question. With that, Mr. Goldwein, we welcome you here to Annapolis.
Well, thank you. That 30 Under 30 was 14 years ago, so just for the record, I'm slightly older than I look. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I'm sorry you won't hear from my colleague Maya MacGuineas, but I promise to be almost as good. I want to start by talking about federal interest costs. That may sound like a boring topic, but the federal government spends about $2.5 billion a year just paying interest on its debt. $2.5 billion. That's $870 billion this year. Projected. You may ask why am I telling you that number? Because that would make it the second largest line item in the entire federal budget. This year, under current projections, the federal government will spend more on interest than it spends on Medicare, and it will spend more on interest than we spend on our entire defense budget. Right? Just a few years ago, historically, defense has been the second largest category of spending, behind only Social Security. This year, it will be the fourth. Our interest on the debt is eating the rest of our budget alive. Now, why is this happening? A couple of reasons. First of all, as many of you may notice, if you've paid a credit card recently or tried to take out a car loan, interest rates have been rising. If we go back to pre-pandemic, the typical interest rate we were paying on government bonds was about 2%, actually below 2%. It, of course, varies for short-term versus long-term, but about 2%. Now, it's 5%. We're paying, I haven't looked this morning, but the 10-year yield I think is 4.6%. The 3-month is 5.5%. We are paying on average 5% interest, which is, again, more than twice as much as we have been paying historically. On top of that, the amount of money we've been paying that interest on has been growing astronomically. We are now $27 trillion in debt, $27 trillion with the T. And in case that doesn't mean anything to you in dollar amount, that's about a year's worth of economic projection. I'm an economist. We like to measure our debt relative to the size of the economy. This actually makes intuitive sense if you think about your personal life. If you make $2 million a year and you have a $200,000 mortgage, no problem. But if you have a $200,000 mortgage and you're making $20,000 a year, a little bit tougher, right? Same thing for the federal government. The richer we are as a society, the more debt we can afford. It's not that debt is inherently bad. It's that we can't have too much of it relative to our ability to pay. And right now, if we're not at that too much, we're pretty darn close at it. We have debt that is 100% of GDP, 98%. I'm going to round to 100. Our debt is as large as the economy. That's triple what it was back in 2001. And now we are borrowing $2 trillion more each year another 6% of GDP each year. Back in 2001, we were running surpluses. How did we get from here to there? Well, it turns out there's a lot of blame to go around. We did some recent analysis, looked at what kind of legislation has passed since 2001, since the last time we were running a budget surplus. What got us from that 33% to that 100%? It turns out that in 2001, we passed tax cuts, and then we followed them by spending increases, and then we followed them by more tax cuts and more spending increases and more tax cuts and more spending increases. And each step along the way, across both parties, we decided the grandkids can pay the cost, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying we think taxes ought to be lower. There's nothing wrong with saying we need to make more investments in this or in that. The problem is that time and again, for the last quarter century, every time we've made one of those decisions, we've decided not to worry about how we're going to pay the bill, to just add it to the debt. We did some analysis that had there been no legislation passed since 2001, other than sort of keeping the lights on, debt would be paid off by now. We'd have no federal debt. Instead, we're at 100% of GDP, roughly attributed equally to the cost of tax cuts, unpaid for, the cost of spending increases that were unpaid for, and the cost of response to major recessions, mainly the global financial crisis before 2010 and the most recent COVID crisis. They're all responsible. And by the way, in case you want to say, well, it's Republicans or it's Democrats or whomever, 80% of this legislation was bipartisan. 80% was bipartisan. And the partisan legislation or executive actions came from both parties. So both parties, often together, have cut taxes, have increased spending, and have decided to kick the bill to the future. Meanwhile, neither party has addressed the underlying growth in spending that already existed in our budget, mainly in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We have an aging population. There are 10,000 Americans are turning 65 every day, which is about the same amount of Americans that are born every day. So our only population growth now is from us getting older, is from people living longer. As an aging society, we are spending more on our major retirement programs, Social Security and Medicare. And on top of all this, our healthcare costs are rising rapidly. That's putting huge upward pressure on Social Security and Medicare. We looked at the deficit in 2001 and compared it to today. 2/3 of the difference is because spending is higher, and most of that is the increased growth of our health and retirement programs. Now, the good news is everything is going to be solved in the future. No, that's not really true. I wish I could tell you that, because the last time that we had debt this high was right after World War II. We had debt at 106% of GDP. And for the next 2.5 decades, we ran essentially balanced budgets every year. Remember I said you don't have to have zero debt. Debt isn't inherently bad. If you run balanced budget for 25 years, your debt is going to erode relative to your economy just from the faster economic growth. And that's what we saw happen after World War II. Our debt to GDP plummeted as our economy grew and we stopped borrowing anymore. That's not the case this time. What we see is those health and retirement programs continue to have upward pressure. So we're going to continue to spend more on Social Security, more on Medicare, more on Medicaid, and our tax revenue is going to remain pretty flat. The result is going to be $2 trillion a year of ongoing borrowing. Under current law, debt is projected to roughly double over the next 30 years to approaching 200% of GDP. The only country that has ever sustained that level of debt and not had some major crisis is Japan, and they have not had any economic growth for the last 3 decades. And that's sort of a generous assumption, because that assumption assumes we let a bunch of tax cuts expire at the end of next year. Many of you may have heard of the expiration of many of the Trump tax cuts. One party wants to extend them for everybody. One party wants to extend them for the 98% of people that make less than $400,000 a year. It's possible that due to lack of agreement, we do let them expire, but that would not be my base case. My guess is we're going to extend at least most of them. It also assumes that we abide by the recent fiscal responsibility caps, even though we've already broken them, already modified them for this year, and already signaled we're going to do it for next year. And then it assumes that we only grow in discretionary spending with inflation forever, which means defense and non-defense as a share of the economy will continue to decline. If you kind of take some looser assumptions and basically say, what if Congress keeps doing what's done historically? Debt would rise to 300% of GDP within 30 years. That is there's no international experience with this. That would not just be unprecedented by US standards, it'd be unprecedented by global standards, and the result would probably be ultimately some kind of economic crisis. Now, why should you care about this debt rising? I mentioned one reason already, which is those interest payments. Interest is now the second largest federal budget item. Within a quarter century, it will be the largest item. That leaves less room for everything else, especially our annual appropriated funding. A second reason, and related reason you should care, is that certain parts of the budget are crowding out other parts. And that includes interest, but it also includes, as I mentioned before, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs that are on autopilot. If we went back to 1960, half the budget was defense. And 2/3 of the budget was decided annually by Congress through the appropriations process. Today, only a quarter of the budget is decided annually, and only about 12% is defense. If we project forward 10 years, those numbers shrink to 20 and 10%. And so what we have is an increasing share of our budget decided by people that are no longer in Congress, are no longer even alive, right? Decided by legislation that we passed in the 30s or in the 60s, or in some cases in the 90s, and on autopilot. And a declining share of our budget decided annually by members of Congress that were elected to actually respond to their voters, right? They were elected to actually look at the current needs of the country. And so we have a budget that is in decline from a democratic perspective. On top of that, rising debt has all sorts of economic consequences. Again, I'm an economics professor, and the textbook problem we point to with debt is something called crowd out. The basic idea is this. When the government sells bonds, people buy those bonds instead of investing elsewhere in America, instead of buying stocks, instead of putting money in the bank that it can then reloan to businesses or to potential homeowners, instead of buying corporate bonds. And so if they're investing less in the private sector, there's less money available for buildings and machinery and software and research and innovation, and that means slower economic growth. And it's not a big deal over 1 year, but it accumulates. And so over 5, over 10, over 20 years, it starts to matter a lot. The Congressional Budget Office, that's the official scorekeeper of the US government, they basically think that if we continue on our current, Congress does what they've been doing, economic growth and income growth over the next 3 decades will be a third slower than it otherwise would be. People will be about $23,000 per year poorer than they otherwise would be from that slower economic growth. Higher debt also pushes up interest rates. You might think like your mortgage rate can't even get any higher than the 7.5% it is now, but it can, believe me. And if we continue to issue this debt without restraint, it may. That means higher cost of housing. It means higher cost of buying a car, of buying a washer dryer that you put on installment plans, of your credit card, of your student debt, of business loans, which makes it harder to start or grow a business. These higher interest rates matter. And then two more things I'll point to is that this higher debt leaves us less room to respond to actual crises. I've said this before, I'm going to say it as many times as possible. Debt is not inherently bad. There are times that borrowing makes a whole lot of sense. If you're in a war, it makes sense to borrow and spread those costs over time. If you have a pandemic, another kind of national emergency, if you're in a recession, it makes sense to borrow because you can actually infuse the economy with money. There are times that borrowing is appropriate, but the more that you borrow in those inappropriate times, the less you have in reserves to borrow when you actually need it. And that's increasingly what we're seeing is a decline in our fiscal space. If we had a recession tomorrow, I think there would be a huge hesitancy to borrow to fight that recession, not only because of our massive amount of debt, but because of the inflationary and interest rate pressures we're facing as a result. And then lastly, sort of the worst case scenario is things could ultimately spin out of control. High debt pushes up interest rates. High interest rates push up interest costs. High interest costs push up debt. And if we get into this debt spiral where things look like there's no solution, where it looks like our debt is just rising too quickly, the markets may very well panic, right? And we've seen how the markets panic with something like Bitcoin, right? Now imagine that with the backbone of the global financial system, the US Treasury. Imagine a panic where investors start bidding up the interest rate. And then people have these old bonds, they're paying 3%, and the new bonds are paying 10%. They're not going to want to hold on to those 3% bonds, so they try to sell them off, but they're valueless, they're worthless. And so then you cause cascading bank failures, things like Silicon Valley Bank times 100 or times 1,000. Global financial crisis. Except unlike the last global financial crisis, we can't bail out the banks because we're the cause, right? Our debt is the cause of the crisis. That's the worst case scenario. I'm optimistic that we're not going to get there. I'm optimistic we're going to solve this because it is a totally solvable problem. We just need our leaders. They're really good at working together to add to the debt. We just need them to come together to actually reduce the debt. We saw a glimmer of this last year with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We saw it throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. In 1983, they came together to fix Social Security. In 86, they came together to fix the tax code. In 1990 and 1997, they came together for more general deficit reduction. We know they can do it, and we know what they have to do. They need to bring healthcare costs under control. And there's such an incredible amount of waste in the healthcare system that there is plenty of room for savings. They need to make Social Security solvent. Right now, Social Security's costs exceed its revenue, and it has this trust fund that is only 9 years from running out, 9 years. The law says that when Social Security runs out, everybody gets a across-the-board 23% cut, which would be about $17,000 for a new couple. We know how to fix it. Change the amount of taxes coming in, adjust the retirement age, change the benefit formula. This is doable, right? We know we need to fix the tax code. The tax code is incredibly expensive in the number of tax breaks it gives, even if our rates are not actually particularly high by international standards. So yeah, we can change the tax rates, but I would start with, let's clean up our code so it's actually efficient and fair and raises more revenue and we don't lose so much in non-compliance. We can do this. We just need Democrats and Republicans to actually come together and say, solving this problem is more important than worrying about the special interest. The next generation is more important than the next election, and we're both going to have to do some things we don't like for the greater good. Hopefully that will happen soon. Thank you.
Thank you. I have some slides. There we go. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Barrett for the invitation to join you today. I want to talk about work that I've been doing with Angus Deaton for the last decade or so, and this talk will draw on a whole body of work. The point of it is really that even before COVID-19, the lives of Americans without a bachelor's degree or any kind of four-year college degree were coming apart. Now that's 2/3 of American adults. So in our work, what we do is document what that means in terms of despair and excess mortality, but also we explore the underlying long-run forces behind that. And we find ourselves in agreement with Michael Sandel, a philosopher from Harvard, who has argued that a BA has become a condition for a good job, for respect, for social esteem. And it's increasingly become a key to a long and healthy life. And let me show you what that looks like in a picture. If you look at life expectancy at age 25, now, so that's how many more years you could expect to live after your 25th birthday. And you just divide that between people with and without a four-year degree. What you see is that for people with a four-year degree, life expectancy kept floating up until COVID hit. That's the bump you see there. That will recover. For people without a four-year college degree, the high water mark for their life expectancy was 2010. And then for an entire decade before the arrival of COVID, life expectancy actually fell. Now, you didn't hear about this from the CDC or read about it in the newspapers or hear about it from Congress. But this is a stunning long-run decline. And historically, it's almost unprecedented that one group would see an increase while another group is actually moving in the other direction. In almost all countries, better educated people live longer, but the idea that they're moving in opposite directions, the only case we saw of this was in a few countries in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's sort of the company we're keeping right now. I'm going to skip this for time. So why are less educated Americans dying younger? So there's been a real slowdown in progress against cardiovascular disease. We could talk about that if you want, but the 3 causes of death that we found were increasing were drugs and alcohol and suicide. And when we saw that, we thought we saw something in common between those 3 causes of death. I mean, they all signal a fair amount of despair, right? They're all death by one's own hand. And for a lot of what we do, we bin those together. And as a shorthand, we called them deaths of despair, which the press picked up on, and now it's taken on a life of its own. But we bin them together in part because it's very hard for a coroner or a medical examiner sometimes to know whether an overdose was intentional or was actually an accident. And this is what it looks like. What you're looking at here are mortality rates. That's deaths per 100,000 people at risk. So you could think of these lines as just being the risk of dying of these various causes, drugs and suicide and alcohol. And what we found after 1989, education was reported on the US standard death certificate. So our work only starts in the early 1990s when most states were compliant with reporting education. And you can pull these from the National Vital Statistics Service. So on my little computer here, I have 80 million death records for people aged 25 and above, starting at 89, and most of our analysis will be based on those records. For people, this is men and women aged 50 to 54 over a 30-year period, you can see that for people with less than a bachelor's degree, really large increases in their deaths from these causes. And other cuts of the data, like people with an associate's degree or some college, they look a lot like people with a high school degree. It's the BA that seems to matter here. Now, that was for people 50 to 54. What you see is that if you take all 5-year age groups from 25 to 29-year-olds in the upper left, down to the 65 to 69 in the bottom right, it's happening in all these age groups. Now, one might have thought that when people got to retirement age and got Medicare and got Social Security, this would disappear. But what's happening is as these cohorts are making their way into retirement, they're bringing these dysfunctions with them. And so instead of looking at actually by age group, what we find is often more important for our work is to look by birth cohort. So this is for people with less than a bachelor's degree. You can see for people who were born in 1940, their mortality rates from deaths of despair is pretty flat. It rises a little bit at the end there. 45 the same, but a big jump between people born in 1945 and people born in 1950. And again, a big jump to people born in 55, and then 60, and then 65. This moves through the baby boomers, through Gen X, and into the millennials. So that if you look at people born a generation apart, people who are now 50, born in 1970 versus 1945, the people born in 1970 have 3 times the risk of dying of a death of despair. So this is the graph I just showed you for people with less than a BA. If you compare that to people with a BA, it looks like they live in different universes. And that's a real problem. It led us to dig, like, what the heck is going on here? Why are these people dying prematurely from things that no one should die of? And it took us all the way back to Durkheim, who wrote this tome on suicide at the end of the 19th century and made a very strong case that stands today that a lack of social integration puts people at risk, that times of great upheaval are times when people tend to turn toward suicide, and into which we also put alcoholism and drug addiction. Where are people dying? It's widespread. Every state saw an increase in each of these causes of death between 2000 and 2020. It's men and women. Oftentimes the news reports only on men, but it's men and women. It's rural and it's urban. So regardless of what you read in the press, who like to report on rural men dying, it is very widespread. What are the underlying causes? Well, we've certainly had a prescription opioid epidemic caused by the Sackler family through Purdue Pharmaceutical, blanketing the country with a drug that's 1.5 times as strong as morphine. It's basically heroin in a pill form with an FDA label on it. That certainly made things worse. But we think even without OxyContin, it started before OxyContin came onto the market, and we think after they turn off the taps, it's going to continue. Whoops. It turns out that opioid epidemics have occurred in times and places where social structures were in disarray. So China, before the Opium Wars, the dynasty was crumbling. The US Civil War was a time of an opioid crisis, especially in the South, among men and women, actually, wives of soldiers. It became known as soldier's disease, men who were addicted to morphine, and then women. It was a world turned upside down. And soldiers in Vietnam, who were then clean once they came home, but were shooting heroin and smoking opium in Vietnam. It's not just a supply side problem. Here's a jam jar full of OxyContin. It's also that despair is a precondition. You know, the ground is fertile for this to happen. And that goes with the ongoing crisis in suicide and alcoholic liver disease and cirrhosis. We think the more profound underlying cause is the labor market for less well-educated people. So if you look at men without a 4-year college degree, prime-age men, 25 to 54, if you look at what happened to median real wages, median being the 50% mark, from 1979 to the eve of COVID, you see this long downward trend. Wages went up and down a little bit with the business cycle, but the overall trend is down. And simultaneously, they were leaving the labor market. So there's a long downward trend also in what's known as the employment to population ratio, which is as simple as it sounds. It's the number of people employed relative to the size of that group. So we think that that actually has a lot to answer for. We don't think it's really just the loss of material well-being, which it certainly is, but it's also the fact that working class people don't think they can get married until one of them at least has a good job, a job with benefits, a job with a ladder up. So there's a lot of cohabitation now, but those cohabitations are fragile. We might have a kid, but then we split up. We might repartner. We might have another kid with somebody else. We split up, but there's no stability there. And also, as industries left the country, local areas saw their tax bases implode, schools rotted, the community went to hell. And so we think that this loss of stability at work, at home, in community is a Durkheimian recipe for suicide. Underneath the body count, there's actually a lot of what we call morbidity, a lot of physical distress. There's a lot more chronic pain, difficulty socializing with your friends, reported, poor mental health, heavy drinking, obesity rates climbing. But we think that at the base of that cauldron is what happened to the low-wage labor market. Because when you have a job and you have self-esteem and you have a way to have a family, then a lot of these other problems tend to disappear. Good jobs for less educated people have become scarcer. Robots and globalization. NAFTA has a lot, the North American Free Trade Agreement has a lot to answer for. A lot of communities saw their industries leave the country. China entering the World Trade Organization also caused a lot of despair. Economists would say, well, there are gainers and losers. But if the gains outweigh the losses, then we should go for it. It's in the national interest. Now, nobody ever compensates the losers in those situations. And this is part of the problem that we face today, is all of that coming home. I want to say, also echoing what was said earlier, the increase in healthcare costs to employers. Healthcare takes $1.05 nearly out of the US economy. Now, if I'm an employer paying my share of a $24,000 a year family policy, I look at my low-wage worker and I say, either I'm going to pay them less because I have to pay their health insurance, or I'm going to let that person go. I'm going to outsource all of those jobs. The third thing that I want to talk about in terms of good jobs is what's known as monopsony. That's where employers have the power to hold wages below what that worker is actually worth. When does that happen? Well, that happens when your potential employees are sitting ducks. They have nowhere to go. It used to be that if you didn't see a good job in your area, you hire a U-Haul, you go to where the good jobs are. Now the cities are so expensive that it's very hard for a working class person to actually get up and go. And the employers know that. And so they pay them less than what they're worth. It turns out that's an antitrust violation. It's against the law. It's very hard to police. The political influence of working class people has declined with the decline in unions, and most believe that the system is rigged in favor of a cosmopolitan, educated elite that's benefiting from globalization and technical change, while the rest of us lose. Now, you would say 2/3 of the American adult population, why don't we vote our way out of this? Well, it turns out that working class people used to vote with the Democrats. But in the 1970s, the Democrats made a decision that they would be the party of the educated elite and minorities. And those are two groups that many working class people see as opposed to their interests, and they hold them responsible for much of what's happened to them. President Clinton, on a panel with Bill Gates and Amartya Sen in 2000, announced the permanent trade status with China, saying it would make both countries more prosperous, and Clinton is quoted as saying, "We are fortunate to be alive at this moment in history." George Packer, in his very good book, writes, you can almost date the election of Donald Trump to that moment. I'm going to skip that and go to my last slide here. What to do? What can we do? Structural change, possibly, in the labor market. If you made sure that the job prerequisites were needed for the job that was actually going to be done, that would make a huge difference. Many companies listed here have actually begun to go in that route. Many state governments have also decided that if it says, the job description says that college education is needed, it better be needed, show me how. So that's going to open up jobs to people who have the skills but maybe not have a piece of paper that shows it. Are students leaving high schools with skills they can use? Good question. An increase in the federal minimum wage, if it wasn't too large, would offer some protection against monopsony. Because with an increase in the wage, the employer is still getting more out of that worker than the federal minimum, even if it were increased. But there's more of a sharing between wages and profits to the employer at that point. And you don't have to worry about trying to police monopsony at that point. But we think healthcare reform is essential. This is an injury we're inflicting on ourselves. The price and the finance mechanism for healthcare, it's played an enormous role in upending the lower wage labor market. If we spend twice what European countries spend per person, if we stopped doing that, we would save $1 trillion a year. That would go a long way. That's I think, half again what we spend on the military. That's just waste or excess spending. So, and we think that the working class labor market and that knock-on effects that would have on their social lives and their personal well-being would be enormous. Now, will that happen? There are 5 healthcare lobbyists for every member of Congress. Just imagine that. 5 standing around me when I'm a congressperson. I'm not hopeful, but I think this is where this has to be done. It would go a long way towards solving the debt crisis that we heard about earlier. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Sobering look at some challenges facing the United States. We're going to take some questions here from the audience. If you have some, please queue up at the microphone, both in the middle of both aisles. And if I might, I'd like to start off with a question to both of you. The theme of this conference is centered around liberal democracies, right? Ms. Goldwein, you've posed a question of the problem of debt, and Dr. Case, medical mortality, morbidity. To what extent are these problems shared by other Western-style democracies? Ms. Goldwein, could I maybe start with you?
Sure. First of all, I'm pleased to hear there's only 5 healthcare lobbyists for every member of Congress. That's a lot lower than I thought, having spent a lot of time up on the Hill. Most countries that are similar to the United States face similar, if not worse, demographic challenges than we do. In other words, the U.S. aging population is not unique. If anything, we're aging less because we still have replacement rate. And most, like the United States, have faced these ongoing obligations and expenses for recession response, et cetera. But most countries differ in one key way, which is that they can actually move policy forward. Generally, because they're parliamentary systems, when the prime minister comes out with a budget, that happens. When our president comes out with a budget, if there's still a newspaper writing about that 2 days later, that's a big win for the president. The president's budget is almost a meaningless document in the United States, whereas in a parliamentary system, it's sort of your path forward. And so for that reason, I think the United States has a lot more struggles with making major changes than other countries have. And so many of our partner countries have already fixed their social security systems. Many of them regularly check in on their healthcare systems and keep them under control, whereas we're kind of stuck. We change our appropriations every year, but the rest of it often stays the same, or if anything, gets built upon.
So the countries in Europe have many things that stop what we see happening in the U.S. And we see the mortality as just like a canary in a coal mine of the fact that bad things are happening to working class people. And if those challenges aren't met, it could have a big effect on democracy. But let me tell you a couple of ways in which they differ. They keep their opioids in check. So they did not bend to the will of pharma companies who wanted to spread them widely so that any doctor with a script could write you a prescription. So that's one. Two, many of them have had a history. A lot of them are smaller countries. Their social safety nets take into account the fact that they need to be buffered against global changes in the demand for their products. So that buffering also tends to help keep working class people from falling as far as they've fallen in the U.S. We don't otherwise see the same level of deaths of despair, although you do see, for example, in the UK, you have London, And then you have the rest of England. And the rest of England looks a lot more like the hinterland does here. And there is a lot of resentment about London. There's a lot of anger. And so I think that that also could cause, going forward, some of what we've seen here.
Very good. Sir, please.
Thank you, Dave Walker. Mark, you talk about the debt problem. We all know we have a problem. The real question is, what's the solution? And the solution is not policy issues, it's process. What type of process and controls? The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget is for a statutory fiscal commission. I commend you for that. I think that's necessary. But the other thing that I think is necessary that I haven't heard CRFB talk about is a constitutional amendment that will limit the growth of the federal government and how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on absent extraordinary conditions. 49 of 50 states have it. And where does CRFB stand on that?
Thank you, and I'll full disclose that Dave Walker, you have been you were on our board previously the last time we talked about this issue, but when we look at other countries, fiscal rules actually are really important for bringing them in line. I'd love to say that like Congress should just do their job, and they should, but they need something to bind them. We see that internationally. We see that at the state and local level where there's control boards. We see that in corporations, and so they do need something to bind them. I think a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget, in my opinion, would be too strict because, as I said, there's times you want to borrow. But putting in place stronger rules to limit our debt growth, we would be in favor of. Obviously, the details matter a whole lot.
Hello. My question was, what exactly are the underlying causes for the expensive healthcare system that we have today?
So I'll start and then we'll move to Mark. We've allowed hospitals to merge. And the FTC has sort of turned a blind eye to the fact that in many cities that has caused, or many regions that's caused monopolies. And so you would imagine when hospitals merge, prices should fall, synergies should develop. Instead, what you see is that prices rise. So we also don't negotiate prices that pharmaceutical companies pay. We've only just begin thinking about that, so that our prices for drugs are like 3 times what they are for major drugs in Australia. Device manufacturers also charge 3 times as much for an artificial hip replacement in the US relative to France, even though it's exactly the same hip that's going into the person. So also the American Medical Association holds down the number of residencies, and by doing that, it holds up the wages of physicians. So they're wealthy enough now that they're at the table when anything is being negotiated, and they are able to protect themselves and keep the money going up the distribution to the owners of these.
Yeah. You know, if you take a micro 101 class, microeconomics 101, and you learn about market failures and you go through them, externality, public good, monopoly, moral hazard, adverse selection, you list them. Healthcare basically suffers from every single one. That's true. It's sort of the most marketed failure good you could possibly think of. Fundamentally, though, there's only 2 things that can drive the cost of healthcare: the amount of healthcare you're buying, or the price per amount of healthcare you're buying. And what we see is both are high in the United States. In the private sector, the price is really the key thing that keeps growing very rapidly. In the public sector, in part because we've started to get some of the Medicare prices under control in some areas, it's the quantity a little more, and that's related to really bad incentives, to all sorts of supply problems, a lot of the things that Dr. Case spoke of. The good news here is this incredible amount of waste lends itself to some relatively easy solutions that can make a big difference. And I'll point to 2 really, really quickly. Right now, Medicare pays more for a doctor's office that's owned by a hospital for the exact same procedure than the doctor's office across the street that's not owned by a hospital. That makes no sense. It's wasting Medicare money, and it's encouraging the hospitals to buy up more doctor's offices. This is called site-neutral payment. Fixing this is called moving to site-neutral payments. It's supported by Newt Gingrich and Elizabeth Warren, right? It has extremely broad-based support. It's not supported by 4 out of the 5 of the healthcare lobbyists. But this should be a no-brainer. The other area I would say to look at is we have these private alternatives to Medicare called Medicare Advantage. These private plans are actually often more efficient than Medicare, and yet they cost the federal government more because essentially they all get bonuses even if they do average work, and they lie is a strong word, but they fib about their risk pool, and so they're overcharging Medicare. There's an incredible amount we can do. This doesn't fix the structural issues, but we can save hundreds of billions of dollars with the easy stuff.
We have time for one more question here. Midshipman, please.
Hello, my name is Midshipman, 3rd class Niehoff. Ma'am, I have a question for you, Dr. Case. In terms of for BAs making people have less of these problems that are leading to like the deaths by despair, what specifically about the BA does that do? I was just thinking in terms of like versus like people that go from high school straight into the labor force, like linemen and firefighters and enlisted.
That is the $64,000 question. What is it? It's not like you can paste a BA on someone and magically they're, but it's the fact that in this meritocracy, when job openings went from newspapers to online advertising, instead of getting a couple hundred resumes, you'd get several thousand resumes. And people started to use having a bachelor's degree as a screen. Don't bother applying if you don't have one. So that's one of the things that's happened. It's also the case that people with a BA, if you read the sociology literature, they tend to think that, well, you could have gotten a BA, but you blew it, right? So you don't deserve what I deserve. Because you don't have a bachelor's degree. The wage premium, meaning the excess over what a high school degree would earn in the labor market, went from 40% higher for a BA in 1980 to over 80% higher today, right? So there was this stunning increase in the reward for having a college degree. And that can buy a lot of self-esteem.
Thank you, ma'am.
Well, I wish we had more time to explore these twin problems of the crushing debt that we're suffering under and the challenges of healthcare and the diverging results between different economic classes. Sadly, we're going to have to end it here. We'll regather at 11:20 for a panel on populism, and if I could ask you please to provide a generous round of applause for Mr. Goldwine, Dr.